we have really good records on. So, and we can talk about those in a bit. There's pretty good documentation. So, documentation that might have been done in the past in different forms, perhaps, carved into stone, might have appeared in petroglyphs or pictographs. We don't have, there aren't any real clear indications, right, that there was a plague that, may have killed people at Salmon at 1050 or something like that. So that's kind of an issue for us. And of course, then we get into the category of, if we're looking at people who have died in the past and we're trying to do some studies with the human remains, which of course we don't do a whole lot of anymore in North America because of the concerns of tribes, right. Very legitimate concerns about their ancestors and how they're treated.
Sure.
But even in those situations where we've had access and people have done some studies, a lot of the illnesses that afflicted people probably on a day-to-day basis, say 1,000 years ago in the Four Corners, those don't leave a lot of record basically in the bones. Now we know that tuberculosis was a New World disease, and as well as in the Old World, and that occasionally we find indications on bone of people who have been impacted by having TB for a number of years, before they passed. Syphilis is one of those diseases that can leave really, evidence in the human skeletal record if people have it again and they're sick for a period of time. But if we look at things like, the common cold, the noroviruses, some of the other ones that we suspect were present in the New World even before, Europeans and other folks from the Old World came in with different diseases, those don't really leave any real record. So we can't always detect the remains of different diseases and sort of those pathways through people and through groups. The other question, of course, is if people die off in a relatively rapid way, then we know, like when we can talk about this, the Black Death in Europe in the middle 14th century, people got buried in large numbers, and right. You can still find those cemeteries and graveyards in different parts of Europe with a whole lot of people having been buried in a relatively rapid period of time. It's not like those tombstones are still readable, but those are pretty well documented. So if we look in the past, and people have done this at various points to try to understand, just like ancient North America, what diseases were prevalent, there's not a whole lot of data on that. And even as we came into the historic period, the Spanish and other Europeans came in, and diseases like smallpox, wreaked a lot of havoc through native populations. Even in those situations and historically known dwellings, and some of the larger sites, we don't have a whole lot of people buried apparently at the same time. So it hasn't been super easy, I would say, to track some of these things that we think they're pretty sure happened at different points.
Gotcha.
In areas where we don't have a strong historical record. So
right.
That's just one of the challenges.
Right, I would think so, especially. And so let's look at some of the articles that you shared with me this morning about kind of what we're talking about. And this first one from the National Interest, just talking a little bit about this maybe first or early pandemic, if you will, or plague. As the screen scrolls up a little bit, we can see the headline of kind of what we're talking about. World's first pandemic might have killed 50 million people, is what the article says. And so talk to me a little bit about this article, Paul Reed, first of all,
right.
And the source.
This was the so-called plague of Justinian. So this
right.
was in the Byzantine Empire after, when Rome was going through its dying throes. Sometime before that, they split into an Eastern and a Western Roman Empire. And so this was the one centered at the city of Byzantine, which later became Constantinople, and so this was in the 520s, and this spread pretty far and wide through the Eastern Roman Empire, and really around the world with what historians have been able to reconstruct, and they've suggested that perhaps between 30 and 50 million people were taken down by this, and this is pretty catastrophic. They're estimating that might have been a third to half of the world's population at the time.
I was going to say, at that time, that would be a big chunk of the people that were on this earth. So yeah.
Right. And this is the Black Death. This is bubonic plague, and really, Its roots seem to go deeper from what epidemiologists and historians have studied, perhaps even thousands of years earlier somewhere. They suspect Central or West Asia, but we don't really have any documentation prior to this time of Justinian in the 520s of it, impacting the world and really causing so many deaths. So, this would have rewritten, at least in the parts that were affected, primarily in the Roman Empire and spreading outward, this would have really changed the time, and we know a lot about the later Black Death plague in the 14th century, but this probably changed history in really significant ways. And there's actually some interesting research that I've just started to look into that discusses this, and this also sort of lines up with a couple of events that happened with volcanic eruptions, and so they're saying that the 500s in Europe really pushed Europe in some different directions, and may have actually sort of helped launch the so-called Dark Ages, if you will.
Right.
That's the time. I mean, there's different ways to model this, but that's the time roughly between the fall of Rome and the late 400s or 500, all the way up to 81,000. So maybe with all these deaths, that also contributed. And of course, with Rome probably wasn't a very wonderful place if you weren't a Roman citizen. But it's sort of that irony, I think, of a dictatorship or an empire where you have widespread peace, even if people are definitely being oppressed. Once the leadership is taken away, then areas can plunge into chaos, and we've certainly seen this more recently around the world in different parts. So that's part of what folks say as well, is that this helped launch into this multi-hundred-year period where Europe, people sort of hunkered down, not a lot of things were done, science, as it was, goes underground, and people barely survived. So,
interesting.
Yeah, definitely a strong impact from this plague.
Right. And during this time, Paul Reed, we had some record keeping, of course, and some folks were able to tell us a little bit about what was going on during this period of world history, correct? And that's kind of how we're able to at least make some of these findings.
Right. We have pretty good historical records from people in Justinian's court. Some really old accounts about just the effects, and people literally dying in the streets, and and during this time period, of course, even into our more recent past here in the U.S., notions of sanitation and cleanliness and how you properly dispose of individuals to keep disease from spreading. These were not the things they practiced, particularly when you're getting, a third to half of your population dying really rapidly.
Right. Exactly. Not good. And then you sent me another article. So let's go back, I guess, and that's what goes back even earlier in history. And so I wanted to show and share that with our viewers and listeners from Live Science, the 20 worst pandemics and epidemics in world history. I think I covered the top 10. But this one starts even earlier than the one we were just talking about. It covers that one as well. But so let me ask you a bit about some of these and how we know what we think we know about them. But this goes back to the prehistoric epidemic, 3000 BC.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And so this one is relatively small scale. The first one they're talking about, because we're talking about a village that seems to have had everyone die within a really short period of time.
Okay.
And so this is, sort of a very well documented event, and something that, despite what I said earlier about challenges in the past, this one seemed pretty clear that this entire village was wiped out in China at about 3000 BCE. So, and this was based on the archaeological work and just finding all of these folks who were rapidly, in graves, or in some cases not buried. So
right, and all around the same time, I guess all.
Yeah, and certainly a horrific event for the folks living there, without question. But I think they're estimating a few thousand. So, not something that at that point affected a lot of the world or the known world.
Somewhat self-contained, I suppose, in that area.
Right, and with the isolation of certain parts of the Far East at that point, for sure.
Right.
Yeah, but again, not much fun to live through. And as we talk about these pathways, the epidemiologists, doctors talk about vectors of disease spread. these are the same things we're facing today. So, and of course, we are armed with a great deal more knowledge. We understand sanitation. We understand how to keep, the one that we're dealing with today, the COVID-19, at bay through staying away from people, washing our hands. None of these things were particularly clear to people in the past. The whole notion of the germ theory of disease, the way we talk about it, really is something that emerged in the 19th century.
That's right.
In the early to mid 1800s. We have evidence before, certainly in different areas of the world, where people were mapped onto the idea that they shouldn't leave people unburied for long periods of time because of the potential, risks of that, and also just, the obvious discomfort of being around people who've been deceased. But, some of those scientific connections, the way we make them today, definitely not real present in the past. People felt like disease was caused by evil spirits, by, the humor theory of the mix of the biles and the bodily fluids not being in balance. And, so this led, of course, to a lot of really bad cures for different things. The bloodletting,
sure.
Sort of the classic medieval barbershops, where you just go bleed out a couple of pints of blood, which actually makes people sicker, ultimately, as we know now. But, some notion of how, disease spread seems to have been present, because we have examples of quarantines, too, where people saw that this group was full of, the city or town was full of a lot of people who were sick, and they were kept from coming over there. So some of that knowledge goes back a ways, but certainly not enough to have prevented some of the more horrific epidemics and pandemics we've seen in history.
Well, talk to me about this plague of Athens in 430.
Yeah. This kind of follows right on the heels of this war, and one of the many between Athens and Sparta that we all read about many years ago in our history classes. And this one, was pretty serious. We've got at least 100,000 people, they estimate, who were attacked, and this is quoting from it, attacked by violent heats in the head, redness and inflammation in the eyes, and then ultimately dying in a relatively short order. And this is one that's fairly, unknown. People have talked about typhoid or some other type of, fever, hemorrhagic fever, potentially even an early example of Ebola occurring. This doesn't seem to have been tied to a bubonic plague or the Black Death, but again, still sort of a mystery. And this again tells us that we can have things that are historically documented and understand them from that standpoint, but we don't always have all of the evidence to say this is definitely what happened.
Right.
This particular locale.
True, and I guess all you can really look at is maybe that we had a lot of people dying around the same time, and can assume it was from some common cause, but then that's where the trail kind of ends.
Right.
In some of these cases.
Right.
So, interesting.
Right, and unless, there's, I don't know, efforts to find folks who died during that time, potentially test them. Again, though, if, with bones, a lot of the diseases that afflict us as humans don't leave a mark in the human skeletal record. So even if the situation was ideal, where there wasn't concerns about those studies and we could do them, we might not find, the evidence of this disease or that. So
interesting. The is it pronounced Antonine plague in AD 165 to 180? That was a long time that it was around.
Right, and that they estimate quite a number of deaths here as well, over 5 million, and this seems to have been the first documented smallpox epidemic that we see worldwide. And this is, the hazards of going out as Rome did, and Roman soldiers did, of invading and conquering and oppressing people in different places around the world. This came back from the margins of, with the Roman campaign, and really then just wreaked havoc inside the capital at Rome itself.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
yeah. Don't
invade places. Here's one of our lessons from history.
There you go. That's true. Plague of Cyprian in 250 to 271, and we'll kind of go through some of these maybe a little bit quicker because I know the big one is coming. As we kind of scroll through this article that you had sent me, there's the plague of Justinian that we've already talked about this morning at 541, 542, and as we keep scrolling around, then we get to, I guess, the granddaddy of them all, as you will, the Black Death, right? And that was the one that we hear a lot about during the Middle Ages, so lots of documentation about just how widespread this was. And I guess the one difference maybe between some of these plagues we're talking about in today is folks back then didn't travel a lot like we do or travel large distances, so these things were relatively contained to their immediate vicinity, but the Black Death seemed to have really gone around the continent of Europe, and that's the kind of the first widespread one that at least I'm aware of. Is that true? Would you agree?
Right. Yeah, I mean, if it's possible that the Justinian plague, the way they've talked about it, was fairly widespread as well. But by this point in Europe in the 14th century, we've got, a lot more people there. We have millions of people packed in to really, the largest cities of that time outside of China or Japan. And you've got traveling peddlers, you have people moving food around. So the level of interaction, if you will, and trade was pretty high at this time. So once the plague got in, it went far and wide. And the dates they list are fairly contained. There was 2 other occurrences of this later in the 1560s and the 1580s. So we sort of had waves, and this was really the worst of it. But again, they estimate perhaps 50 million people died. Right. This is something like 40 to 45% of what historians have guessed for the population of all of Europe at this time. So
exactly.
This is another course-changing pandemic that really changed the way things worked in Europe. And people have argued that this led, a couple hundred years later into the beginnings of the Enlightenment and sort of the early scientific revolution, because things simply changed and Europe's feudal system had to change because so many of the people who labored to create that were gone. So,
right.
Not that we would applaud this in any way, but this just is illustrative again of the effects of these epidemics on societies, and it's not like there's always a bouncing back to some earlier point. This definitely bounced Europe onto a different path.
Right, and again, this era of history, not really great medical care during this time.
No, definitely not. I mean, again, we've folks have probably seen Monty Python and sort of the depiction of, the guy riding around with the wheelbarrow and bringing out your dead. I mean, the accounts that we have from it suggest that people were dying in those numbers and that they were barely keeping up with getting folks into some sort of makeshift graves.
Right.
During this time, just to literally clear the streets. So yeah, this not something that any of us want to live through, for sure.
Very true. Next one, Paul, read and help me with the pronunciation of this. I'm going to mangle it, I know. 1548, 1545 to 1548.
Right.
Coccolizzi. Yeah, epidemic.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and again, just this is one of the horrific consequences of Europeans coming into North and South America. Right. And spreading disease into populations that had no resistance whatsoever. I noted that they have a picture of Aztec ruins national monument, which is unfortunate because...
Well, I wondered about that picture. It seemed to be very familiar looking to me, and then it doesn't really relate to this part of it. But anyway, why,
we're apparently stuck with this name. Although I being somewhat reformer-minded person that I am, thinking it might be nice to change this name, because apparently whoever put this article together did their own image search and said, oh, here's an Aztec site.
Oh, right.
And pulled it up. So that looks like the pathway to me. But anyway, yeah, this was a virus that they've described as a hemorrhagic fever that killed at least 15 million people in Mexico and Central America. So this was the heartland of the ancient Aztec Empire, with millions of people brought in under this system, and just amazing architecture, different stela that they carved, the amazing agricultural systems in their floating fields. And, as part of the Spanish entrance into this area, this disease came through and just ravaged, and just, took out lots and lots of folks.
Interesting. And again, mostly, tied back to the Spanish, right? Or those other folks that were now here on this continent and the natives did not have immunity to some of these things that were being brought over.
Right, and this probably wasn't the first wave that came through with the Spanish, hitting the ground at about 1519, and this is in the 1540s. So, we had influenza, smallpox, some other diseases that went through, but this one in particular came through and was just really, had a huge impact. Of course, this is after the Spanish had taken over the Aztec Empire, essentially partnering with the Aztecans' enemies, the Tlaxcalans primarily, and saying, well, these guys are bad. They're they've dominated you. Let's take them out, and then things will be better. And of course, sometimes the enemy of your enemy is not your friend.
Right.
And in this case, it definitely wasn't ultimately for the native peoples in central Mexico.
Didn't go well. Then we get into the 16th century when we get the plagues in North America, right? And that's some of the other well-documented things that you were talking about, the smallpox and other things, correct, that the Europeans brought over.
Right. We got different waves, and influenza had some role, measles, and some other diseases, but smallpox is really the one that stands out. And there were smallpox epidemics in North America well into the late 19th century that were still afflicting different populations, and particularly different native groups. So these were just really horrific, working their way through different groups, and in many cases spreading even in advance of there being colonies and a whole lot of Europeans in different places, just because of, again, the contact of early people getting out, scouts, trappers, different people who had contracted the disease, maybe gotten over it, but were still carriers, and then making contact with different groups. So that, that's the way these things are mapped by the epidemiologists and the archaeologists and the historians, is that those actually move. Many of the worst diseases moved in advance of even clustered settlements of Europeans at different points. So, we're pretty horrific.
Interesting. And then we get the Great Plague of London in the 17th century.
Right. So again, this is 300 years after the Black Death in the 14th century, but no cure, no antibiotics at this point. And of course, we should point out that bubonic plague is not something you want to get today.
Still,
but if you do get it, it's a pretty simple course of antibiotics for 10 days, and you're fine. And of course, one of the interesting things about pathways is that sometimes our rabbit population here in the Southwest, there'll be a spike up in bubonic plague,
right?
And so you get this run of what people call somewhat frivolously plague bunnies, and if they start trapping them to check, then trying to remember the highest percentage from the 90s, there was at some point where there was something like 10 or 12% of the bunnies sampled had plague. But people don't have a whole lot of close contact. And anyway, so 1660s in London.
Interesting.
The city is big at this point, a couple 100,000 people, potentially even larger with the surrounding area.
Right.
And you've got a concentration of people. You have the rodents who we know now were only the carriers of the fleas that had, were the main cause of transmission. And you've got this going through London really quickly.
Right. As big as it wasn't the most clean city in the world. And when you have all those people living on top of each other and in close proximity, and as you mentioned, the rodents, it's really a recipe for something like this to happen, is it not?
Right. And, and the irony, and it, not that, we can always judge things from our 21st century position in understanding science and demography and the growth of cities, et cetera. These cities continue to grow, and London, of course, is today a city of 10 million, depending upon how far out you want to draw your boundaries, and certainly a lot cleaner. And no aspersions to my friends in London.
No, we don't want to do that. That's true.
But
But it is part of their history.
Yeah, we had this happen, the big plague in the 1340s and 50s. Then we've got it 300 years later, and then we had other plagues at various points. And so we tend as humans, I think, to some of us at least, to look at our cities and our urban areas as sort of the height, the peak of what we describe as our own civilization. But they were concentrated areas for diseases to get into, and then to really have huge impacts on the population. So, if we're trying to look at this as things generally get better as we move into the future, there's certainly, we could have some counter arguments about that from different perspectives. But through time, cities have had many, many, many plagues. So, and certainly we're seeing that today, unfortunately, with New York City now being one of the hot spots, just simply because of the concentration of millions and millions of people.
The final one I want to ask you about, Paul Reed, is this one Great Plague of Marseille in France, 1720, 1723. And what do we know about that one?
Right. This is bubonic plague again. Again, this is kind of back to the idea of, this happened in London just 80 years earlier, and then in France. And they tracked to a ship coming back from the Eastern Mediterranean, and even with a quarantine in place. So this is perhaps, something that we might want to think about today. So the ship was quarantined, but you've got plague-infected rodents with fleas who are getting off the ship, getting into the city. And then the plague spread quickly and, again, killed perhaps, they think, 100,000 people in the area.
Interesting.
With a city of perhaps 300,000, that's 30% mortality. That's among, certainly, the worst that we've seen in history.
Exactly. And so I guess, Paul Reed, to kind of wrap up our conversation this morning, which has been fascinating, at least to me, I hope the audience feels the same way, but what it says to me is that the human population has been pretty resilient with all these things that have been going on for millennia, really, on this planet. I mean, even though there's plagues and epidemics and things like that, the human population continues to grow and expand. I guess, is that a positive we can take from all this morning?
Well, right, definitely. We have a lot of resiliency, in our species, and we have survived a whole lot of different things. One of the things that, of course, I'm inclined to think about in an archaeological and historical way is, what have we learned along the way? And, sort of the final thing to mention is, I don't really want to call it the Spanish flu, even though I did. We tend to label these things wrongly, but between 1918 and 1920, we had probably the most documented deaths that we know of in the history. And again, just documented. There might have been other events, but perhaps 50 to 100 million people worldwide. World War I was still ongoing, so troops were being shipped all over the world and spreading, this really horrific disease through that primary means. And so this is 100 years ago. We look at these things in the past and say, yeah, that was bad. And of course, what made this bad and what makes the situation we're dealing with bad today is we're talking about the differences between viral infections and bacterial ones. We have bubonic plague, smallpox, other diseases, measles, under control because they're bacteria and we have antibiotics. Basically, flu, influenza, and these other viral-based ones, there's usually no immunity until it gets into the population. And then we work on vaccines, of course. So that kind of circles us back to where we're at today with the battle to get a grip on the COVID-19 in the United States and worldwide. And, the need for a vaccine, which many, many people around the world, smart people, are working on. But realistically, months away, probably into next year.
And that's true. And so again, if we talk about that, the Spanish flu, as it was called earlier in the 20th century, there was a lot of quarantines and a lot of other precautions that we're seeing even today with the current situation that those folks did even 100 years ago, right? And to try to protect themselves. In some cities, it worked better than others that took the precautions. I think there's been some well-documented cases of that in between maybe St. Louis and Philadelphia are the ones that I remember hearing about.
Right, exactly. Philadelphia had this big parade scheduled for returning soldiers in the fall of 1918, and they didn't cancel that. So there was something like 200,000 people in the streets, and Philadelphia paid the price. Just not even weeks, days later.
Lots
St.
of
Louis,
spread.
on the other hand, really locked down, and so if you look at the death rates, they're hugely variant between the cities. So this is encouraging news. Again, not to make light of what happened in Philadelphia 100 years ago, but if we do the things that our medical folks are telling us to do, we really can have an impact and slow the spread and ultimately end up in a much better position in terms of people getting sick and people passing away.
Very true. Well, Paul, it's been fascinating this morning. I appreciate your insights as always, and you taking the time to join me today. Thanks so much.
Scott, enjoyed it as always, and we'll see where we're at next month. So.
All right. We stay well, stay home, stay healthy, as we say, and we'll talk to you again in about a month.
Sounds great. Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. Thank you very much. That is archaeologist Paul Reed. He works for Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins, my guest here on KSJE. KSJE is supported by the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work Four Corners program. They're proud to offer a Master's of Social Work degree in the Four Corners community. Applications for the 2020-2022 cohort is now open. Classes are taught Fridays and Saturdays in Durango, Colorado. Find out more at 970-247-9773 or at du.edu/